Good morning, everyone. I am Christy Connor, the host of Friday Coffee Meetup. Friday Coffee Meetup is the largest active innovation, entrepreneurial and tech meetup in Los Angeles, California. We're enjoying some beautiful weather out here this morning, and we hope you are as well. We are a community that normally meets in person, but due to the stay-at-home restrictions, we're currently meeting virtually, and we're so happy to have all of our members here with us this morning. If you're missing our event, we do have a YouTube channel and a podcast channel available. Jen is going to be posting that information in the Zoom chat, so you can check that out there. So grab a cup of coffee if you have extra time on your hands and go check out our videos and our podcasts. In addition to myself, although you're seeing my face, there's actually a whole host of people behind me that work tirelessly to put this on each week for the community. And these are their faces. So we have people that help with getting speakers, alignment, our podcast, our YouTube channel, and it actually takes a village to put this on every week. So we're really grateful for them. We are also grateful for Echo Factory, who sponsors us. So thank you for being behind us, supporting us financially and with resources as well. This morning, we're going to be handling our questions and answers after David speaks this morning through the Q&A panel. You can find the Q&A panel at the center of the screen down towards the bottom, and you can put your questions in there. I will ask you, please be succinct in your questions. I will be aggregating them, and if it's a paragraph, I probably won't check it out. So put your questions there. We will not be doing any Q&A from the chat panel, so don't list your questions in the chat panel. We have opened up the chat to allow you to be able to communicate with one another because we know community is important, but we're not monitoring that. So, you know, be on your best behavior. And I think Jen might publish some questions in there as well to get some interaction. In addition, at the end, we are going to open it up for open networking. So if you're interested in meeting some of your fellow attendees, please stay on the line at the end, and we will move you over into the panelist pool where you'll be able to interact, use your video, use your voice, and get to know others around you. Our speaker, David Pendergast, is going to stay on for that section as well in case you come up with any additional questions you might want to ask. And that is moderated by Wayne Little, one of our co-organizers. With that, I'm so excited to have everyone here this morning. We are looking forward to hearing from David Pendergast. He is with Latham Watkins, and he will be talking to us about startup fundraising. We know that it's a very difficult thing, and so he's going to talk to us about the different perspectives from the different players that you may need to bring together in order to be successful at startups fundraising. He has a really interesting background, an international background. He was the co-founder of Arrivo Corporation, which worked in urban transportation. And he's also had roles in corporate development, legal leadership roles in Hyperloop 1 and PCH International. At PCH International, he played a key role in their investment in more than 80 different hardware startups. And then internationally, prior to that, he was also an IPO and capital markets lawyer in Hong Kong. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to David. Today is going to be kind of a conversation. So David, welcome and thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks a lot. Happy to be here and hope everyone's doing well and staying healthy. And I was just trying to send some emails out on a deal that's closing before we got started here. So as Christy said, I started my career as a lawyer here in the US. I was in Phoenix. I was doing kind of like mergers and acquisitions and public company representation. And I did that for several years and then moved over to Hong Kong where I became a capital markets lawyer, which was doing IPOs, representing investment banks and bond deals throughout Asia. A lot of work in China, as you might imagine, Indonesia and India and Singapore, all throughout the region. And then I had an opportunity to join a company called PCH, which was a client of ours. And They were a very interesting company. It was founded by a guy from Ireland who built up a business over a long period of time. He had lived in California, so PCH, he was inspired by the highway here and named his business after that. But he went to China at an interesting time where manufacturing was moving from Ireland, consumer electronics manufacturing was moving from Ireland, which had served Europe, over to China. And at the very early stages got involved in that sort of phenomenon that was occurring, and built an incredible business, which is still doing incredible today. At the time I joined them, it was about $1 billion in revenue, serving one of the top 10 vendors for Apple, worked with Beats by Dre and those sorts of consumer electronics companies. And what was fun about that job is I got to both work on the big company business, which had a very different profile than some of the other activities that we were doing, which was moving into the startup world and kind of operating startups within the corporate umbrella. So we acquired a small engineering firm in San Francisco, a couple different mechanical engineers. One guy had come out of IDEO, and the other guy had been at Apple. He designed the original circle trackpad for the iPod. And we grew their team ultimately over the next few years to about 80 engineers, and worked with big companies and small. But the other one was we started a sort of venture-like investing and accelerator program called Highway1. We did our best to model it off of Y Combinator or Techstars. And I got to be a part of sort of, setting that up, deciding what our sort of standard form investment documents would look like, and shaping the program. We had a tremendous amount of mentors internally and externally. We were focused on hardware tech companies. And the thesis was we could utilize this big supply chain operation and manufacturing relationships in China together with on the ground rapid prototyping capabilities in San Francisco, and sort of help startups navigate. You've got a concept, you've maybe got an early prototype in hardware, but how do you go from that to mass production and shipping products to consumers around the world? So a good example, there's a company called, I think it was called Blaze Bike Light, a couple founders out of London. When we met them, I think it was like a team of 6 people. And 6 months after we met them, they were shipping their product to about 130 countries. So we helped them find a factory, sat in the middle of their financial sort of transactions, which made it easier for the factory to take the order, and help them grow and scale. And they got invested in by Richard Branson and some other good VCs in London. But most of our companies were here in San Francisco. So despite living in Hong Kong, I was probably in San Francisco 2 weeks a month, 1 to 2 weeks a month for about a 2-year period, which was kind of fun because I got to live in different Airbnb places every time I came and got to see the whole city. But we invested, I would say, we probably looked at 1,000 different startups while I was there. There was a sort of a group of folks that were specifically focused on that had, one of them had been an entrepreneur in resident at Khosla, and another guy had run some other corporate VCs before. And I was kind of part of more of a broader, well, not broader in the sense of people, but broader in the sense of skill sets across the PCH businesses that ultimately, after, the list of applicants to our programs had been narrowed down to, let's say, 30 to 40, then we would get summaries of those, and we would help the decision makers figure out which ones they wanted to include and, invite into our program. So it was ultimately the guys who ran the programs, their decision, but it was a very, collaborative sort of dialogue process. And that was a lot of fun to see, that many different companies and entrepreneurs that were passionate about building things. And then as the deals move forward, I would just do those deals myself to save on legal fees. Even as a big company, we were cost sensitive on spending money on lawyers, which every startup should be. And so I got to, work in that venture world, which was very different from, representing Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs on an IPO. I loved it and worked for PCH for about 3 years. It came time for us our kids were getting a little bit older in Hong Kong. My wife is from the US, I'm from the US. And we decided that we wanted to come back here. And I was actually going to take a law firm job at that time. This was in 2015. I was going to go back to the same law firm I had been at, a firm called Davis Polk. I was going to be in their Menlo Park office and doing IPOs again. And then I got a call from a friend of mine who said, have you ever heard of a company called Hyperloop? And I said, yeah, I read the white paper the day it came out. It sounds amazing. And what's going on? And he suggested that they, were looking for an in-house counsel that had some, experience dealing with hardware, experience dealing with international issues that kind of business would face. Think about compliance with export controls rules and FCPA and things of that nature, and just doing business, globally. PCH is an Irish company. I think we had 26 subsidiaries in probably 13 different countries. And so, sort of seeing that, how businesses operate across borders, I think was and probably still is, part of what Hyperloop will need to think about. So I ended up backing out of the law firm job, and we moved to LA from Hong Kong in 2015. We moved to Pasadena initially and loved it. I was at Hyperloop for about 6 months. I'm not going to kind of go into the details here. You could probably read about it in the media if you're so inclined. But about 6 months in, the technical co-founder of Hyperloop, a guy named Brogan, and myself, and some other executives decided to leave Hyperloop. And ultimately, we ended up forming our own company called Areevo. And Areevo was, I still think our technology would have been a huge boon for LA and other places. Our goal was to look at transit systems and optimize urban transit. So Hyperloop, as you might know, is focused on intercity transit. So it's a long distance, very high speed transit technology, where a big part of the emphasis and value proposition is high speed. For us, we wanted to focus more on not getting in between cities, but getting around cities. And there's a lot of, different good ideas that people are looking at doing, autonomous vehicles being one, shared, scooters and micromobility being another, more, traditional rail transit, and that sort of thing. And who knows what is the right answer. But our view was that if you wanted to move people efficiently in urban dense environments, the best way to do that would be to radically increase the throughput on the existing physical infrastructure that is available for transportation. So I think I probably get this wrong, but I used to have it on the tip of my tongue, that I think the average freeway can move like 3,000 vehicles per hour per lane. And when we were modeling out and simulating our system, we could move like 20,000 car-sized vehicles per hour in the same physical space as one lane of highway. And so our technology, you think of it more as like an internet, network, except in the physical world. So our tech and what we were focusing on develop was, sort of in some ways similar to Hyperloop, but fundamentally different in that our core tech was more around networking and switching, switching vehicles in and out versus high speed. We didn't need to go, you don't need to go 700 miles an hour if you're just going from Pasadena to LAX. The point is to sort of get in and out of a congested freeway and then be able to densely pack vehicles. And there were some cool things that, I certainly believed in. And from a tech perspective, I think that was never the question in investors' minds. I probably pitched 200 different investors in when I was a founder of Areevo. And, it's a slog. You get a lot of no's, you get a lot of, kind of crazy looks sometimes, especially when you're trying to do something that admittedly had a ton of challenges, even if we got the tech right. But the tech, our sense was it was there and nobody told us otherwise. Obviously, a lot of challenging development things to do, but we had a phenomenal team of engineers led by Brogan and some other folks that had been at SpaceX very early and Tesla and other, wonderful places. But the challenge, from an investor perspective was, let's say you deliver on the technology. We believe the business model is wildly successful and actually, cheaper for consumers and good for, the environment and city governments and all sorts of things. Like, you've convinced us of that. But, on what timeline is this going to happen? And how do you control political risk? If a government says you can do this and they get, somebody else gets elected, how are you going to control that? And of course, the answer is we can't control that. And so we had some pilot projects that we were trying to get going, but ultimately, that lesson of, from an investor perspective, VCs, they, generally, as a rule of thumb, a venture capital firm is set up in a way where the guys that run the fund or the women that run the fund, they need to return the capital to their LPs on a 7 to 10 year time frame. And for companies, it's a trend now that companies are staying private longer generally, but for a company that's building physical infrastructure that needs government approval and that sort of thing, you could appreciate from an investor perspective why they'd be concerned about us being able to deliver a product on that time frame. Ultimately, for a variety of reasons, I think that's being one of them. Areevo, we decided to close it down. It was pretty, it was sad and it was tough, thankfully. And I think this was the core focus of my co-founders and myself, was that all of our people, landed in a good place. And, we had supportive investors who helped us make sure that people, had healthcare coverage as long as possible and that sort of thing. And thankfully, all of our employees basically had new jobs within a couple of weeks. LA is I think still a very dynamic place, but and when that happened, as I was joking earlier with Christy, my wife and I decided I needed to get a real job again. And Latham was my outside counsel, and I decided to come join them. And I work in the emerging companies group, is what it's called. So we represent startups and venture capital firms. I probably spend 50% of my time working with our partners in Silicon Valley, and 50% of my time working here on local companies in LA. We've got, I would say, I don't know, maybe 100, 150 companies that we represent here in Los Angeles that are anywhere from, two folks that have just founded a company and have zero investment, all the way up to, companies that are being considered for hundreds of millions of dollars acquisitions. We represented Ring, for example, and now I'm going to forget the name of the company that just got bought by eBay. So everything in between, and our group just focuses on the VC. I represent some of the Silicon Valley VCs that I've represented are Eclipse and 8BC, and my partners and friends, represent like Sequoia and Andreessen Horowitz. So it's interesting to be now in this vantage point where, I've been a corporate sort of VC, which, corporate strategic investors think about what they invest in very differently than a financial VC. I've been in the founder role, and now representing, both VCs, I kind of get a window into how they think about deals. And then, of course, working with our own founder clients and startups as they scale and see, the difficulties and challenges that they have, raising money and growing the business. So that's sort of my background. And one of the themes that I wanted to talk about after having shared some of that and some of the stories from that is fundraising and pulling together investments. One of the things that I think when I first came involved in this world at PCH, people often were very focused on the financing itself as a milestone, raising capital itself as a goal. And I think that's true and accurate, that it's a huge achievement to have somebody write a check and believe in what you're trying to build. But ultimately, that's not the goal. That's not what the purpose, the purpose of you starting a business is not to raise financing. The purpose is to take that money and build something. And, generally building a new business is, really, really hard. And the more support you have and good people around you, the better. And that notion that I think I included in a little blurb about what I wanted to talk about here is, think of, I think you should look at your financing activities as trying to build a team. You're building relationships with investors that you think, not just write you a check, but ultimately are going to be there to support you as you grow a business over time, and help you open doors, help you think through very difficult situations, that might come up with employees or customers or vendors. Every startup has a sort of hero's journey up and down cycle. Even the best ones that everybody sees today as being very successful have all had near-death experiences. And getting through those times, having a really solid investor that's seen across a bunch of portfolio companies, they've got experience from doing that. So building a team, pulling together folks that you can rely on and that are going to rely on you and hold you accountable, is important as well. That point about being held accountable, it's easy for people to move forward on something in a venture where they think they're moving at a pace that's great. They see progress that's tremendous in their mind based on being in the day-to-day, and often it is tremendous progress. But with the VC or a legal counsel or somebody else that's involved that isn't there in the day-to-day, they have a different vantage point from your progress. Maybe you're talking with them every week or every other week, just briefly, but every quarter you're having a board meeting or a more thorough check-in, and they really kind of dig into your progress. Well, seeing those sort of snapshots of the business, month 1, 3 months later, 6 months later, brings a different perspective where I think you can add a lot of value. So this sort of team and the being held accountable to each other, and those are two of the things. But the other point I wanted to touch on is, I know, because I've heard it from founder clients, and I heard it from coworkers and others when I was in business roles. Oftentimes people can be when they're looking to raise money, can be frustrated about VCs and how long they take to make decisions, or whether they say yes or no, whether what their message back to you actually is a no, and should you bug them again? Do you feel awkward bugging them again? And then, if you do get a no, they can sort of be, and you see them invest in something else. I'll give you an example. With Areevo, we met with SoftBank, and they sent a team to come meet with us and spent a whole day with us. And a week later, they ended up passing, and a week later they invested in WAG. And WAG, I think at the time, made sense. But some of my more technical engineering co-founders were scratching their heads around, here we are trying to build, this sort of ambitious, world-changing industrial infrastructure technology, and we thought it was really inspiring. And they chose to invest in a company that's focused on, optimizing and helping people find, care for their pets. And what I had to explain to some of the folks at the time, and the point I'm trying to make now is however good your idea is, and however ambitious or world-changing it is, at the end of the day, it's a business, and investors have responsibilities to their investors, just like you'll have responsibility to your investors, and they've made commitments and obligations to their LPs and others about when are the LPs going to get their money back, what is the profile of return, how much capital is it going to take to grow this business, what are the unit economics going forward, and is this the type of business that can scale in a way that makes sense for a venture model in the first place. One of the comments we got at Arrivo from a very good venture firm was, this isn't a venture business. This is fascinating, but you should be talking to family offices and trying to find sovereign wealth funds. And the challenge of that, of course, is they often don't invest in something that early and risky. So that's kind of the model of today. If your business is not one that's going to scale extremely fast, and it's called a 3 to 5 year time frame that sets up the ability for a venture capital firm to have an exit in years 5, 6, or 7, sometimes years 7 to 10, depending on how the fund is set up. It doesn't matter how cool your business is or how solid it is. if it's not going to potentially have a huge outcome, it just doesn't work for the way venture capital funds are organized today. And the other point to think about as well is a lot of VCs, they sign what's called, they sign basically an LLC agreement with their LPs. And to some degree, the folks that you're speaking with have discretion on what they invest in, but they might have made commitments to their LPs around thematic type investment focus, about how much they would allocate to one type of company versus another. And some of them might even have, approval requirements and committees that they need to go get approval from. And that can be, something that you don't always have visibility into. And sometimes it's easy to ask. Sometimes investors will volunteer it, but sometimes, you might not ever know the answer to that. And you just try to figure it out, from looking at their portfolio on the website, from talking, if you can, to other founders that they've invested in, talking if you've got angel investors, great value add that an angel investor brings is they might have some insights into, who might invest in your business and what they're looking for and these sorts of dynamics that the investor is dealing with. So it's, always think about, what is the other person's expectations, responsibilities, obligations, and am I a fit for that? And that sort of takes me to, I think, what I'll kind of make as a last point, and then would love to have more of a dialogue here, is there are an awful lot of folks, in the investing world and on the founder world who, we're all just interested in what people are doing. It's cool to hear about somebody building a new business that they're passionate about. It's fun to kind of, hear about new technologies and new businesses. And I'll say, in hindsight, looking back with Areevo, there were probably, I don't know what the percentage was, maybe 20% of our investor meetings where ultimately, that investor was never going to write a check into our business. It just was not a fit. And, we wanted to take every meeting we could. And, certainly there's a logical, belief in take every meeting that you can. But there's also sort of, it's kind of, I have a friend who told me, when I had our first kid, whatever you do, make sure you put your kid on the schedule, otherwise they won't sleep. And if you put them on a schedule, though, you're going to screw them up, so they won't sleep either. So whatever you do, don't put them on a schedule. These sort of conflicting advice, that people say in here. So there's the take every meeting you can philosophy, and there's, maybe that works for some, but there's also, I think, be targeted with your time philosophy. And, really, to the extent that investors want to meet with you and you're interested in meeting with them, think really hard about, is this really somebody that's going to be a fit for me, and am I going to be a fit for them? Because, your time is, somebody told me that Elon used to say, the value of time is more than the cost of cost. It's the most valuable resource you have as a founder trying to build a business is your time. And if you're spending it with folks that may not necessarily want to write a check because you think, I'm just going to throw this name out there. This isn't what, the name that happened with us, but, Sequoia never would have invested in our business, most likely. Maybe today they're starting to change a little bit what they focus on, but, a software oriented VC never would have invested in an industrial infrastructure hardware company. But I'll tell you, if we had gotten a reach out from Sequoia, we would have been flattered and would have wanted to go meet with them. And in hindsight, what I would do today, having been through that before, is I wouldn't do that meeting. I would say, if you're really interested, come to LA and, come to our office and we'd be happy to meet with you. But I'm just not convinced that we're a fit for you. And I'd love it if we were, but I'm not convinced that, based on what you've invested in before, that we're the right fit. So do your homework, figure out what people invest in, and that can save you time and also help you sort of get to the right people faster. So one thing that, you might meet an investor and you're not a fit, but they've got friends who they think might be a fit. And so not necessarily a no is a negative. It could lead to other yeses down the road. So I'll pause there, and hopefully, Christy, I don't know how we facilitate, but happy to take questions, talk about anything more that folks are curious about, but hopefully have a little bit more of a dialogue. And I'd love to hear, from everyone here to the extent you're comfortable sharing. I think the chat thing is open. If you want to share what you're involved in, what your background is, that would be cool to see, and get a sense of who's listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. As David mentioned, we are going to open it up for Q&A now. Please ask your questions in the Q&A panel. You can find it in the bottom center of your screen. We won't be answering questions from the chat window, but as David mentioned, please do put information about who you are, your background, why you came and joined us this morning. So with that, first question, David, tell me about one of your projects that you really enjoyed. You've been involved in so many things. Do you have a favorite?
Favorite's hard to say. Different things have different stress levels. Often people tell me, you're crazy. You went back to being a lawyer. You have to work so many hours. It must be so stressful. And I say, yeah, I work crazy hours. It's insane how many hours I work. It's super relaxing because it's nowhere near as stressful as being a founder when people's livelihoods are dependent upon whether you raise money or not, or you get a customer contract and things of that nature. So, being a lawyer has its own stresses, but I'd say right now I'm really happy with what I'm doing. Helping entrepreneurs. I'll share a little thing about me. For about 5 years, after I left being an IPO lawyer and where I am today, I was kind of more in a business role, and I thought that might be where I spent the rest of my career. And what I kind of figured out during that time is I think I'm probably a better lawyer than I ever will be a business person. So being a lawyer who's kind of business minded probably is a higher ceiling for me than being a business person who, no matter how hard I try, will always have a little bit of lawyer in me and think about things in a risk averse way, which not necessarily that's not bad, but in a business setting, you'd see different personalities, and you see folks that are very entrepreneurial or very good at sales. And I'll tell you, they probably, are a little bit different in thinking about risk than I do. So where I'm at today is just a ton of fun. We represent phenomenal companies here in LA. I think LA is basically what Silicon Valley was 30 years ago in terms of what we have in front of us. So I feel like, if you could rewind the clock and be a Silicon Valley lawyer 30 years ago, and where would you be today? That's what I sort of expect is going to come in LA over the next 20 to 30 years of my career. And that's super fun to think about, being part of the first, there's been a couple IPOs here, but I think there's going to be a lot more. Historically, LA tech companies have been acquired and haven't IPO'd. And the VC and investment, terms in LA, and we still see a lingering some of this, are, I would say a little bit different than Silicon Valley in the sense of, I'll give you just one example. In Silicon Valley today, nobody uses convertible notes when they start a company, and investors don't expect them. They use a safe, which is easier, I think, to deal with from a founder perspective because it's not debt and it doesn't have a maturity date that kind of is breathing down your neck. Whereas in LA, we still see a lot of folks that want and expect a convertible note, or potentially, stricter terms from an investor side perspective. So that's all to say, I think like LA, we're on the cusp of, and it's been tremendous what's happened historically here. Obviously, we're building on top of what others have built. But I would say in the next 10 to 20 years, I keep saying this to my friends that I work with in Silicon Valley, and they kind of scoff at me still, but I'm like, it's just a matter of time, but LA is going to be bigger than Silicon Valley. So just wait. And, we've got some cool stuff coming. So working with a lot of different companies, getting to see a lot of different founders, a lot of different businesses, and, investors as well. It's just a fun vantage point. And, it's for me, at least, it's less stressful than being a founder.
Fantastic. And I agree. And part of our kind of role here at Friday Coffee Meetup is that focus on innovation and bringing that to the Southern California community. So I agree. And I'm looking forward to seeing that happen myself. Our next question is, why would startups today consider going to VCs when they can now get funding and supporters on great terms via equity crowdfunding?
It's a great question. And I think equity crowdfunding is a great option for some companies. One of the things that you should always focus on to some degree, and it's a balance because there's a tension in what I'm going to say. To some degree, you want to focus on, well, what keeps the most doors open for my future financings? Excuse me. And that's in tension with, well, if I don't get money now, there's not going to be a future financing. And, so the crowdfunding platforms, and there's a lot of different ones. And so you can't sort of paint with a very broad stroke. But to some degree, more institutional VCs who will be able to write bigger checks later on, I think there's still a little, I don't know what the right word is. There's valid reasons why they don't like them. And there's maybe, snobby reasons why they don't like crowdfunding sites. And the valid reasons are, just, and again, it depends on who they are. But one of the things I often tell my clients is, some of the most time demanding and potentially difficult investors that you will have if you get into a distressed situation. And almost every startup gets in a distressed situation, no matter how good they are, no matter how good the outcome ultimately is. I'm telling you, they all go through stress situations. So when you're in a distressed situation, small investors that have come through crowdfunding sites or otherwise, they may have more at risk in the sense that it's personal money that, they may have stretched to put this in here. And just having a volume of investors on your cap table can just be a lot of work. It results in more legal cost, I'll tell you, because you've got to deal with more investors on the cap table when you do your future deals. And so those are the valid reasons, I think why VCs and, folks that counsel founders would say, think twice about it. Now, on the positive side, there's some really, really good ones, that effectively function as VCs and have made a lot of effort towards building relationships with VCs and understand some of the perspectives. This goes to my point earlier of understanding different people's perspectives. It's I think the good crowdfunding sites have become light years from where they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So thinking through how they're going to help you. This is another issue, with the crowdfunding site. Are they going to be there? Is there sort of a person who is managing that and maybe a gatekeeper for the crowdfunding site that functions more or less as like a MD at a VC fund would function, and they can be there to help support you and give you guidance along the way to make introductions to you. So those are some of the factors I think go into considering that. But on the other hand, I'll go back to the first point, which is if you're not able to get money in to get you off the ground, to get the metrics that you hear from the VCs you need to have before they'll talk to you, you might not have another choice.
Okay. Our next question is, are you aware of VCs whose only criteria are great ROI potential and major societal impact regardless of industry? Old economy industrial startups have nowhere to go for funding in this person's experience.
I have a very similar experience. And so I think that first of all VCs are focused on ROI. They have to be. And they have to be focused on ROI in a very different way than, very solid businesses would achieve. If you're growing a business that, is going to have 40% gross margins, most VCs, that just doesn't work for them. Full stop. That's just, and as building a hardware company, Apple's gross margin, I think, is like 45%. SpaceX is probably, I have no idea because I don't know, but it's probably somewhere around there. And that just immediately eliminates, a huge swath of VCs who, for cynical reasons, I could describe cynically or positively, over the last 10 to 15 years have been accustomed to investing in and having wildly successful financial outcomes in companies that had gross margins of 90%, 95%. So SaaS business, software as a service business, enterprise software, social media type companies, these sorts of platforms, they have extremely high profit margins, and VCs have had tremendous success investing in those kind of companies. So VC, keep in mind, they have to go through their own fundraising process which from what I've been told is just as hard, if not more difficult than the fundraising process a founder goes through. And for them to get money, they have to go convince, very risk averse portfolio managers and insurance funds and pension fund people that they should allocate a portion of their capital to a very risky VC fund. And the only way they do that is through track record. You can't, it's very hard for a new person trying to start a fund if they don't have an investing track record. And how do you have that track record? Well, if you've had a bunch of these successful outcomes, and over the last 10 to 15 years, most of those successful outcomes have been businesses that have a very different profile than the one I was trying to build and the one I think the questioner is talking about. So that sort of goes to, what sort of, what challenges they face. Now, I will say that there are some very good investors here in LA that are focused on these sorts of companies. Riot Ventures is very focused on industrial technology and early stage. Lux Capital, which kind of spends some time there, maybe a little bit later stage, has for a very long time been focused on industrial technologies. There's a new group at MIT called The Engine, which is operating just like a VC fund that is not, is focused just in Boston, but is focused, across the country. There's a guy here in town named Peter Lee at Embark Ventures and his partners that are focused on these sorts of things. Eclipse Ventures does look at industrial technologies and have people that have actually built factories as their venture partners. And those are the ones that are coming to mind right now, but that's where, spend some time. The other one I'll mention, Root Ventures, Avidan Ross, who, I think most of their time is spent in San Francisco, but, they spend some time in LA. They're very early stage hardware focused folks. So spend some time kind of thinking about, looking at folks' portfolios. There's so many more resources today than there were 10 years ago between Crunchbase and PitchBook and these sorts of things. And, looking at, find a company that, you think is somewhat analogous to your business model or to your technology and find out who their investors are. VCs, probably the good ones, aren't going to invest in something directly competitive, but they will, not because they're restricted from doing so, but it's just good business and ethics. But they'll invest in something that's ancillary. They'll invest in something that might be supportive. You might be a customer of one of their portfolio companies or a supplier. So, look at what people have done before and what their focus is.
Thank you for that. Dean, you can talk a little bit about if you stay after, so I guess it was around a patented highway safety system that's a disruptor for an open 11 billion market that would save injuries and lives. So Dean, if you stay after, maybe you can chat about that further. Let's try and get maybe like one or two more questions in very quickly. How has COVID-19 impacted your line of business and startup fundraising? Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel?
Great question. I had a baby in April, so I kind of stepped out for a month when this was all happening and came back into it. What happened, right when the shutdowns and the stay-at-home orders were issued, what happened, it was, and I was probably there for a week before my son was born, and then, saw this as I was watching emails and, sitting at home. Immediately, everyone was freaked out. Investors were freaked out. Founders were freaked out. Everyone didn't know what was going to happen. It was just this massive uncertainty. And that happened, I would say that sort of, went on for a few days. And then the PPP loan program came out. And, it was so confusing and the rules kept changing and nobody knew if a startup was going to be eligible, and different law firms were saying different things about who was eligible. And then, it was just this massive, more confusion. And so for like 2 weeks, that was like, it was PPP all day, every day. Should I apply for this loan? Am I eligible for this loan? Am I going to go to jail if I wasn't eligible? All of these questions that were real questions. And we had some, one of the things that's great about Latham is we've got these phenomenal subject matter experts because we've got big, huge company clients and so subject matter experts in government contracts and export controls and IP and sort of things like that. And our government contracts guy is phenomenal. And I'll tell you, he probably worked 23 hours a day for like 3 weeks in a row, just answering all these questions. And, you know, our view was, to some degree, a startup might be eligible, but often some of the VCs, even if the company might be eligible, technically they were nervous about it because, you know, there's publicity risk around, you know, hot startup company backed by, you know, fancy Silicon Valley venture capital firm or fancy LA venture firm gets a PPP loan, you know, and Joe Smith, pizza shop owner, doesn't, and his business goes broke. You know, like that's not probably good optics 3, 4, 6 months from now, when ambitious city prosecutors and district attorneys start to try to make careers out of going after people in this world. So that was kind of the next phase. And then what I would say is people kind of calmed down a little bit and focused on, all right, now, how do we raise money if we need to shore up our financial position? And we saw a lot of deals get done. You know, some were flat in terms of valuation, some were up. You know, for good companies, there still was opportunity. And depending on business model, you know, every kind of macroeconomic shift like this creates an opportunity for new business models. You know, think of an Instacart and how well they're doing today versus, you know, 2 months ago or before COVID. So we saw a lot of, you know, deals get done, a lot of bridge loans. We've also sadly seen a lot of good companies, you know, not make it. And that's sad. And, you know, absent COVID would probably still be doing well. But because of COVID, you know, just didn't. And that's unfortunate. So where we're seeing today is we're still seeing new companies get formed. We're still seeing seed financings happen. We're still seeing Series A and Series B deals get done. I'm as busy as I've ever been, thankfully. And I will say that's true about our group here in LA and in our broader group within the firm. I think everyone is very busy. And it's a combination of, you know, the opportunity for businesses that, you know, in a new paradigm that people think is going to be really reality going forward, are getting funded, and there's competition to get into those companies. But, you know, there's still new, you know, I formed a new company, you know, last week, and they got a seed financing. So it's still happening. And I think there's still opportunity, which is great. And in LA, you know, I think there's going to be tremendous opportunity, you know, in the near term, in the midterm, and longer term. So
wonderful. And we're a little bit over, but let's do one last question that came in earlier around financials. The example is kind of if a brick and mortar business the business model has numbers that are X, what are good ways to determine a technical digital-based business model numbers in early stages and at scale without great comparables or a sufficient test run? Mm-hmm. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll give you one, I'll step back and I'll come back to the specific metrics question. But keep in mind, just as a rule of thumb, this is not a black and white rule. It's not a rule applicable to all VCs. But keep in mind that generally it's true that a VC fund is hoping that each individual investment it makes can repay its entire fund. So if I'm a $20 million fund, I'm going to make, you know, that's going to be a seed focused fund. I'm probably going to make, you know, 15 to 20 to even more, you know, smaller investments at the early stage. And my hope is that each one of those could repay that full $20 million. And so who you're talking to, an investor, you know, they're going to think about it that way. And so does your business, in terms of what the unit economics, do they deliver a business that potentially has that value? Now, certainly they want to repay even way more than the fund, but they wanted a minimum in a downside scenario for each one to have that opportunity. So think about your unit economics that way, is what kind of return are you going to deliver for your investors? You know, how do you shift from a brick and mortar business with traditional retail margins into something online? I wish I knew more. That's an area where I just haven't had a ton of experience. But generally, you know, I would say, you know, the margin profile that you're looking for is going to be comparable to look for companies that have either done that transition or, you know, were a startup that replaced a traditional brick and mortar business.
Thanks, David. Thanks for answering all our questions today and for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So David is going to stay online with us. In a moment, we will move attendees over from the attendee into the panelist panel. We are dark next week, so don't join us next week, but join us the week after on July 10th for Adriana Torreson. And she's going to talk about her experiences of how her own startup failure can help you so you can avoid those lessons in the future, which we're really excited about. You'll recognize her. She's one of our Friday Coffee Meetup regulars, and we are really excited to hear from her. With that, I want to say thank you. Have a fantastic 4th of July next weekend, and we will look forward to seeing you on the 10th. Take care, everyone.